My name is Violetta Cole. I was 33 the year I got engaged to a man whose mother would later call me nothing to my face, in front of 60 people, over a folded contract on a white tablecloth. I own Cole Iron Works, a structural steel and custom fabrication shop on the industrial side of Erie, Pennsylvania. We build staircases, railings, load-bearing frames, the kind of steel that holds a building up without anyone ever thinking about it. 14 years ago it was one propane forge in my grandfather's garage, and me sweeping metal shavings off the concrete floor after school. Now it's a shop with 11 welders on payroll and contracts with 3 general contractors who call me before they call anyone else, because when Cole Iron Works says a beam will hold, it holds. You would not guess any of that to look at me. I wear the same canvas coveralls I wore at 19, stained permanently at the knees. I drive a truck with 200,000 miles on it, and a dent in the tailgate I've never bothered to fix. I learned a long time ago that the fastest way to lose people is to let them see what you actually have, so I got good at looking like I had nothing. I told myself that was humility. It was armor, and I wore it so long I forgot it was armor at all. I learned that from my grandfather, Barrett Cole, who raised me after my parents stopped being able to. He worked iron for 40 years and never once acted like the calluses on his hands made him less than the men in clean shirts who hired him. He kept one tool above every other in that shop, a hand-forged steel tri-square. Its edge worn smooth from his palm, with 2 words stamped into the handle: measure twice. He died when I was 20. He left me almost nothing you could put a number on. He left me that square, and I have carried it into every important room of my life since. I met Ozias Winslow at 6 in the morning in a foot of fresh snow, in the parking lot of the high school where he teaches history, helping a substitute custodian chip ice off the front steps before the buses came in, which nobody paid him to do. I'd been called out to look at a railing that had come loose in the cold. We talked for 20 minutes while my crew worked. He never asked what I did for a living exactly. He asked what I was reading. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel the need to make myself smaller in front of someone. 2 years later I understood exactly why he'd never asked what I was worth. In his family, that question only got asked about people they'd already decided to reject. I knew the name Winslow before I knew Ozias. Everyone in that part of Pennsylvania did. It's carved over the reading room at the county library, and it hangs under the oldest portraits in the Historical Society, next to a black and white photograph of the Winslow Mill, which ran 3 shifts a day for 60 years before it closed. Ozias had built a small, quiet life entirely outside that name, teaching history for a public salary his mother considered beneath him. When he was with me he seemed lighter, like a man who had set something heavy down. "It's why I love you," he told me once. "You have no idea who my family is and you wouldn't care if you did." He was right. I didn't care about the portraits or the mill. What I noticed, even then, was how carefully he said my family, the way you name weather moving in off the lake. Now, let me back up, because none of what I let happen makes sense unless you understand what I wanted. I didn't want the Winslow's money. I wanted the table. I grew up with one grandfather and a rented house and no cousins at Thanksgiving. I built a company because I was good at building things out of nothing, but you cannot build a family out of nothing. You have to be let in. So when Ozias got down on one knee in that same snowy parking lot, on the same spot where we'd met, with a plain gold band he'd saved 3 months of a teacher's salary to buy, I said yes before he finished the question. I thought I was saying yes to him. In my heart, I was also saying yes to the Winslows, to Sunday dinners and a name that had been standing before me and would go on standing after. I had no idea I'd just handed them the one thing they'd been waiting for. The first thing that happened after I said yes, I told myself didn't mean anything. That's how it always starts. The first dinner was at the Winslow house on Lantern Hill, a big brick colonial that had clearly been grand once, and was tired now in ways I noticed and pretended not to. Tempest Winslow met me at the door in pearls and a smile that could cut glass. She held my hand a second too long, looked at the grease under my thumbnail that no amount of scrubbing ever fully lifts, and asked warmly what I did for the Winslow account, assuming I was hired help for the evening. I own a fabrication company, I said. Structural steel. You mean you weld, she said, the way you correct a child's grammar, and the smile never moved. At the table, Ozias's sister Onyx leaned in with the interest of a woman conducting a survey. And your family, she said. Are they local? My grandfather raised me. He passed a few years back. Oh, Onyx said, and let the silence do the rest. I sat there, a woman who employed 11 welders and had steel with her company's stamp holding up half the new buildings downtown. And I let them believe the dented truck in the driveway was the whole of it. Ozias squeezed my hand under the table, like he was proud of how well I was taking it. I told myself I was being gracious. The truth is older and uglier than that. I was doing what I always did. I was making myself small, so they'd have no reason to send me away. Here is the part one need you to understand, because my grandfather's shop is where this whole habit started. And it's also where I first learned to notice the thing that eventually saved me. In fabrication, before you ever strike an arc, you check your measurements twice because steel doesn't forgive a mistake once it's welded. My grandfather taught me that a small wrong number, ignored early, becomes a building that doesn't stand. I had spent my whole career reading the fine print on other people's contracts, catching a general contractor once trying to shave 2 inches off a load spec that would have mattered in a storm. I noticed things. That was my whole profession. I noticed at that very first dinner that Ozias's father, Auburn, barely spoke, and that he watched his wife the way you watch whether you're not sure about. I noticed that Onyx asked 3 questions about my income for every 1 question about my life. I noticed that Tempest's rings, when she reached for her wine, were loose enough to spin on her finger, and that the cuffs of her blazer were restitched at the seam in a shade of thread that didn't quite match. Small things. The kind you could explain away individually and only understand later. Once you had enough of them lined up on a table. I didn't line them up. Not yet. I was too busy rehearsing which fork to use. Tempest began planning a wedding I hadn't asked her to plan. It would be at the Wintergreen Club, of course, because Winslows had always married at the Wintergreen Club. The guest list would be handled by her, because there were people who had to be invited. When I mentioned inviting my crew, the men who'd built my life alongside me, she smiled and said we'd see about space. Everything I wanted was something we'd see about. Everything they wanted was already decided. I let it happen because pushing back felt like handing them a reason. If you've ever sat at a table where your welcome came with a list of conditions, you already know the particular silence where you swallow the thing you meant to say. I told myself I could earn my way in if I was patient enough. I didn't know yet that the door had never been built to open on patience. It had been built to open on their timeline in their room, with everyone they'd invited watching when it finally did. What followed were the tests, though nobody ever called them that. Tempest watched which fork I reached for and corrected me with her eyes before I touched the wrong one. When I mentioned a documentary I'd liked, Onyx said, "Oh, that's fun," in the voice you use for a child's drawing. When I spoke, Tempest would wait a beat and repeat what I'd said in slightly better phrasing, as if translating me for the room. I have negotiated steel contracts with men who tried to bury me in fine print, and I never once felt as managed as I did at that table. Each correction carried the same message, patient and total. You are not one of us. You can visit. You cannot stay. And none of it was ever loud enough to name. If I'd told Ozias his mother kept insulting me, he could honestly have said she was just talking about forks. That was the design. Death by 1,000 forks. I finally said something to him on the drive home one night, not an accusation, just a small careful truth. Your mother doesn't like me. He sighed the tired sigh of a man who'd been managing this weather his whole life. She's like that with everyone. Just don't give her anything to hold on to. I asked what that meant. Don't make waves. Let her run the wedding. It's easier. I looked out the window at the dark going by and felt something I didn't have a name for yet. I had wanted him to say she was wrong about me, and that he'd make her stop. Instead, he'd asked me to be quieter. And the terrible part is that I understood. He'd spent 30 years learning that the way to survive Tempest Winslow was to give her no edges to grip. He wasn't betraying me. He was teaching me to do what he did. But I didn't want to survive her. I wanted him to stand in front of me. Onyx invited me to coffee, just the two of us, to get to know each other before the wedding. She arrived with a leather folder and a smile that was warmer than usual. And I should have known better. The questions started. And they weren't the questions of a woman getting to know a sister. Where did I live? Did I own or rent? How many people worked for me roughly? Was the shop seasonal? She wasn't trying to find out how much I had. She was trying to confirm how little. I gave her small, true, incomplete answers and watched her write the story she wanted. Part of it was the old armor. Part of it was something colder and newer. A sense that I was being investigated. And that whatever they were building, I didn't want them to know yet what I actually was. I heard the word for the first time through a door I wasn't supposed to be behind. Another dinner, another hallway, and Tempest's voice from the study. Low and certain in a way she never sounded in front of guests. We need to protect the family, she was saying. Onyx answered something I couldn't catch. Then Tempest again, clear as a bell. She's clearly after what's left. A gold digger, plain as that. I stood in that dark hallway with my hand on the wall. Gold digger sat in my chest like a swallowed stone. But it was 3 other words that kept me standing there. After what's left. You don't say what's left about a full account. You say it about a draining one. I went back to the table and smiled. And I started, very quietly, to pay attention. The next morning I called my attorney. Not to attack anyone. To protect what I'd built. She told me the thing lawyers say that sounds cold until you've needed it. Violetta, you have a company worth 8 figures and no protection at all. We fixed that before the wedding, not after. We drafted a prenuptial agreement of my own. One that kept Coal Iron Works, my properties, and my accounts separate from anyone who might one day decide they were family property. I signed nothing that day. I just made sure that whatever the Winslows were planning, I wouldn't walk into it with empty hands. I found out what what's left meant on a Saturday at the house on Lantern Hill, looking for a bathroom and opening the wrong door. It was the study. The first thing I saw was a rectangle on the wall, clean and bright against faded paneling, the exact shape of a painting that used to hang there. I know that shape from every job site where something's been removed in a hurry. Around the room there were more of them. A cabinet stood open and half empty. On the desk, not hidden, sat a short stack of mail. The top envelope had a bank's logo and a red stamp reading past due. Under it, the corner of a glossy sheet from an auction house, marked for appraisal. I stood very still. And without deciding to, I closed my hand around my grandfather's tri-square in my coat pocket, the way I do when the ground stops feeling steady. The whole story turned over like a coin. They hadn't looked down on me because I had nothing. They'd looked down on me because I had something real and growing in mine, and they were quietly, desperately running out. After that door, every insult I'd swallowed changed flavor. It had never been about protecting a legacy. There was no legacy left to protect. It was about controlling the story in the room, so nobody would count the empty spaces on the walls. Later that same visit, I passed the study again. The door was cracked, and Tempest was inside alone. Holding one of the empty frames, polishing the glass over nothing, her hands moving in small careful circles. Her hands were shaking. She didn't know I saw her. She would have died before she let me see. I understood, watching her, that 40 years ago she had probably walked into this family with less than they had, and they had measured her at the door too. She'd spent 4 decades learning to be a wall so smooth nobody could grip her the way they once had. She wasn't the author of the cruelty. She was its longest-serving employee. I felt something I hadn't planned to feel. Not forgiveness. Just recognition. She had a name and no money. I had money and no name. And one of us still believed that made me the one who brought nothing. You'd think, knowing what I knew, I'd have left. I didn't because I still loved Ozias. and because I still wanted the table, even a table in a frightened, hollowed-out house. That's the part I'm least proud of. The ultimatum arrived dressed as a formality. 3 weeks before the wedding, Ozias told me, looking at his shoes, that his mother thought we should have a prenup. Just to make everyone comfortable. Onyx's attorney was drawing it up. When it came, I read it twice. It wasn't a prenup. It was a surrender. In the event of divorce, everything I brought into the marriage, coal ironworks, my properties, everything I'd built with my own hands before I'd ever heard the name Winslow, would be defined as family property, held in trust by the Winslows. They still thought I was poor. This whole crushing document had been built to protect a fortune that didn't exist, from a fortune they didn't believe I had either. It would have been almost funny if it weren't aimed at the one thing in the world that was truly mine. I laid their document flat on our kitchen table, and asked Ozias if he knew what it said. He read it. And instead of the anger I hoped for, he got quiet, and then he said the words that ended something between us I'm not sure ever fully came back. Just sign it. It's only paper. You and I both know we'll never get divorced, so it doesn't matter what it says. Sign it, make her comfortable, and we can just be happy. It's only paper, he said, the way people say things when they've never had to build anything and so can't imagine losing it. I told him I'd think about it, and that night I lay awake and understood, finally, that nobody was ever going to hand me a place at that table. Not even him. I called my attorney in the morning, and this time it was different. I asked her to prepare a full financial disclosure, the real numbers laid out plainly, and to finalize my own prenuptial agreement with 1 page of plain legal fact at the front. That an agreement pushed on someone without their own counsel, and without honest disclosure of both sides' assets isn't worth the paper it's printed on. Onyx let it slip a week later, confirming numbers for the rehearsal dinner. 60 people. All the important ones, she said, smiling with teeth. Everyone will be there to witness you joining the family. Witness you joining the family. I understood then what the rehearsal dinner was actually going to be. Not a dinner. A stage, with 60 of the oldest names in the county chosen on purpose, because a woman alone at a kitchen table can say no, but a woman in a white dress in front of 60 watching faces is supposed to be too ashamed to refuse. I did not decide to humiliate anyone. I decided only that whatever happened in that room, it was going to happen in the light, and I was going to walk into it exactly my full size. The Wintergreen Club was beautiful in the way a stage set is beautiful, if you know where to look. I knew where to look by then. The flowers were silk, dressed up under warm light, so most people wouldn't notice. The staff was half what a room that size should have had. The chandeliers were dimmed to a flattering gold that also happened to hide the worn carpet and a water stain near the ceiling. 60 of the oldest names in the county sat at round tables believing they were dining in Old Money's house. I knew better now. Tempest worked the room like the performance of her life, radiant, touching elbows, calling people darling. Onyx orbited her. At the far end of the head table sat Auburn Winslow, quiet as always, watching me the way you watch whether you're not sure about. When our eyes met, he didn't look away, and something in his face was almost an apology he didn't have the courage to make out loud. I took my seat with my clutch in my lap. Inside my coat, folded flat, was my folder. Their document was already tucked under Tempest's place setting, waiting for its moment. My grandfather's tri-square was in my pocket. It happened between the salad and the toast. Tempest stood, tapped her glass, thanked everyone for coming, said a few gracious words about family and legacy and protecting what generations had built. Then, still smiling, she drew the document from under her place setting and slid it across the white tablecloth until it rested in front of me. There's just one small family matter to attend to first, she said, her voice carrying to the back tables. Fiona Violetta, dear. Before you join this family, we need you to sign this. She let the pause open, long enough for every one of the 60 to feel it. Then she said the thing she'd clearly been wanting to say for 2 years. Sign it, gold digger. You bring nothing to this family. The room didn't gasp. It went still, worse than a gasp. 60 Forks paused halfway up. Ozias had gone white beside me. Onyx watched with the hungry stillness of someone who'd waited a long time for a show. Tempest stood over me, gracious and merciless, holding out a pen. I looked at the document. Then I looked up at her, picked up the pen, and did the one thing she wasn't prepared for. I smiled. I did not sign. I read. In the event of dissolution of the marriage, I said calm and clear into the silence, the party of the second part shall relinquish all claim to assets, and shall convey any and all property, business interests, and holdings brought into the marriage to the Winslow Family Trust. I looked up. That's me. The party of the second part. Everything I bring, signed over to your family forever. Is that right, Tempest? Her smile flickered because this wasn't the script. In her script I was supposed to be crying by now, or fleeing, or signing my name in shame. Instead I held the pen over the line and let the whole room lean in, certain they were about to watch a gold digger sign her own surrender. It's a generous document, I said quietly. It really does account for everything I'm bringing to this family. Then I set the pen down, and I did not sign. Into the confused silence, I reached into my coat and laid a plain manila folder on the table. There's just one thing it's missing, I said. The other party's disclosure. A fair agreement shows both people's numbers. So let me show you mine. I began to read. Coal Iron Works. Structural steel and custom fabrication. 11 welders, contracts across 3 counties. The valuation of my company. Behind me, somewhere a fork touched a plate and stopped. I read the properties I owned outright. The accounts. I laid each page face up as I went. A plain paper trail of a life built by hand. With every page the arithmetic in that room ran backward and then broke. You said I bring nothing to this family, I said, looking at Tempest, whose face had gone the color of the tablecloth. Let's read what nothing looks like. At the end of the head table, Auburn Winslow put both hands flat on the table and half rose out of his chair, because he was the only person in that room who actually knew what the family accounts held. And he understood before anyone else exactly which family in this marriage had been marrying up. He caught himself and sat back down slowly, and he did not take his eyes off me. Here is where they thought it ended. They thought I would slide my own document across the table now and crush them with it in front of 60 witnesses. Hold the empty frames and the past due notices up to the light. It would have been easy. It would have made me exactly what they'd called me. So I didn't. I took out the last page of my folder, my own prenuptial agreement, and I laid it down without reading it aloud. I brought a document too, I said quietly. Mine protects what I made from anyone who ever decides it's theirs. I was going to sign it and marry into this family anyway, because I wanted to belong here more than I wanted to be safe. I stood up. I'm not going to sign yours, I said to Tempest. And I'm not going to marry your family. I never was. I turned to Ozias. I'll marry you at the courthouse Tuesday, with nothing changing hands but a promise and no one's name on it but ours. Or I'll wish you a good life and go build mine. But I am done earning a seat at a table that put a price on me. Choose now. Not for her. For you. The room was utterly silent. Ozias stood. For a long moment he looked at his mother, and then at me, and I watched 30 years of learning to be smooth war with something braver underneath. Then he walked around the table, past his mother's outstretched hand, and stood beside me, and took my hand in front of all 60 of them. He turned to Tempest. You just showed me exactly who values what in this family. Tempest's composure cracked for the first time in the 2 years I'd known her. You have no idea, she hissed, quiet, meant only for me but loud enough for the front tables, what it costs to keep this family's name. For just a second I did feel it. 30 years, the empty frames, the shaking hands. I didn't hate her. But I didn't sit back down either. Auburn caught my eye from the end of the table, and gave me the smallest nod. I picked up my folder and my grandfather's square and walked out of that beautiful, dimly lit, silk-flowered room with my hand in Ozias's, my full size at last. We married on a Tuesday morning at the county courthouse. I wore a simple dress and carried my grandfather's tri-square in my coat pocket. Ozias wore his good coat, the one mended at the elbow. Two of my welders stood as witnesses. The men who'd built my life alongside me. The ones Tempest would have seen about space for. There were no silk flowers, no 60 faces doing arithmetic. Just a clerk, a promise, and nothing changing hands but that. Auburn came. He stood at the back of the small room alone, the way he'd watched me from the head table. And afterward he took my hand in both of his rough old ones and held it a moment. "We were the ones marrying up," he said, quiet enough that only I could hear. I'm sorry it took me this long to say it out loud. Tempest didn't come. I didn't expect her to, and I found, standing in that plain bright room, that I didn't need her to. The table I'd spent 2 years trying to earn my way into had turned out to be a stage in a house running on nerve and silk flowers. And I had walked off it into a marriage that finally had room in it for my full size. The house on Lantern Hill sold that autumn. The Winslow name stayed carved over the library the way it always had, but the town learned soon enough what had been hiding behind it, the way towns do. I didn't lift a finger to save the Winslows, and I didn't lift a finger to sink them either. I let them keep their name and their debt and their empty frames, and I stayed out of it, because their story was no longer mine to write. Coal Iron Works took on 2 more counties that year. Ozias kept teaching history and learned slowly how to stand in front of me instead of beside me while I bled. We bought a house with money I'd made with my own hands. And we put both our names on the deed, separate and clear and honest, everything in the open the way a fair agreement is supposed to be. He never once asked me to be smaller again. I hung my grandfather's tri-square on the wall of my new office, in the spot where the morning light hits it first. Not hidden in a glove box anymore. Not shameful, not small. Right out where anyone who comes to talk business can see it. Worn smooth at the edge. Worth more to me than every painting that ever hung in that study on Lantern Hill. Sometimes early before the crews roll out, I stand and look at it, and I think about the empty rectangle on Tempest's wall, the ghost of a thing she sold to keep a name. And I think about what I put up in its place instead. She spent her life defending a wall with nothing behind it. I spent mine ashamed of everything I'd actually built. In the end, only one of us learned to put her worth where the light could reach it. Here is the only lesson I took from all of it, and I give it to you plainly. Worth isn't something you inherit at a table someone else sets. It's something you build with your own 2 hands, and no one, no matter whose name is carved over a library, gets to slide it back across the tablecloth and call it nothing. It's been 3 years since that rehearsal dinner, and I still think about it more than I expected to. Not with anger anymore. With a kind of clean, settled quiet, like a shop floor swept down at the end of a long shift. I think about Tempest shaking hands over that empty frame more than I think about the pen she handed me. I think about Auburn's nod from the end of the table. I think, most of all, about my grandfather standing over a forge telling a girl who didn't yet understand him that worth isn't inherited, it's built. If anyone has ever made you feel like you brought nothing to a table you helped set, I want you to do something small tonight. Go count what you actually built with your own 2 hands, out loud, in your own kitchen if you have to. It doesn't need an audience. It just needs to be said once by you to you. What would you have done in that room, with that pen already in your hand? I'd genuinely like to know. Tell me in the comments below.